Hello, my name is Abigail Richardson-Schulte, and I am composer in residence with the Hamilton Philharmonic Orchestra. Today I am going to introduce you to some great composers of the past. Now, composers are people that write music. So we're going to start off in the Baroque period with the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. Now, by the way, the term classical music actually refers to hundreds and hundreds of years of different styles of music. So in order to tell what we're talking about, we actually separate them out into eras. So the Baroque era, 1600 to 1750, the Classical era, 1750 to 1830, and the Romantic era, 1830 to 1900. Those are the specific ones we'll be talking about today. Now, composers and musicians in the Baroque era earned their living either at a court or a church. So music had been a very important part of the church for hundreds of years before the Baroque period. And that's because, well, music was part of the church service, and also composers were asked to write special music for special days in the church. Now, music in the court happened shortly before the Baroque period with Louis XIV, who was the French king, and he built himself a fabulous palace, the Palace of Versailles, and Louis XIV was a trendsetter. And so he would invite royals from across Europe, and they would come and see his beautiful palace, they would come and see his beautiful clothes, and they would want to dress like him, and they would hear his orchestra, and they would want their own orchestra. So in those days, that first orchestra was only made up of violins. Now our orchestra has, the string section is made up of violins, violas, cellos, basses. We have the woodwinds, flutes, clarinets, oboes, bassoon, the brass, for French horns, trumpets, trombones, and tuba, and the percussion section. Now, once the royals would go and visit Versailles, then they would go back to their own places and they would want to make a palace like Versailles. So we have a number of copies in Europe. And they would also want an orchestra. And so that's how the tradition of music at court spread. And now composers at court might write courtly dances like this one. This is a musette by Johann Sebastian Bach. Now, Bach, across his lifetime, 1685 to 1750, had a number of different positions at both courts and churches. Now, there are a couple of very interesting stories I'm going to tell you about Johann Sebastian Bach. Now, the first is that in those days, there weren't university programs to go and study music at. If somebody wanted very high-level instruction, they would have to go and find a master, a mentor, and go and study with them. Now, Bach, as a young man at 20, already had a position at a church, but he wanted more instruction. So he managed to get 4 weeks' leave to go and study with the great composer and organist Dietrich Buxtehude in northern Germany. And so Bach he walked 450 kilometers. But once he got there, it was worth it because he was welcomed into the family with open arms, and Buxtehude taught him a lot. Buxtehude was also so impressed with Bach, he offered him his own position. Now, this is one of the finest positions in all of Europe, and it would have been quite something for Bach to have it at 20 years old. But there was a catch. Buxtehude wanted Bach to marry his daughter. Well, Bach said no, and he walked 450 kilometers home. By that point, he'd been gone for a whole month, and he really made his employer very angry. Now, he moved from church to court and court to church so that he could rise up in the rankings and get some more money along the way. And he did need money because he had a lot of children. Would you believe he actually had 20 children, although sadly only 10 of them lived to adulthood. But still, that's a lot of mouths to feed. Now, at one point, he'd been working for the Duke of Weimar at a court for almost 10 years. And Bach had been doing the job of the old Kapellmeister, the old musician in charge who was writing music and conducted, or should have been, but he was too old to do that. So it was tradition for somebody younger in the court to just take over those duties, but not actually have the position. So Bach had been doing that, and when the Kapellmeister died, Bach was sure that he would get the position because he had been doing a really good job. Well, he was furious when he heard that the Duke was looking elsewhere. And so Bach used his own connections and found himself a better position at a different court, as Kapellmeister and with more money. But his own Duke of Weimar was furious when he heard this, and so much so that he refused to let Bach leave. Why could he do that? Well, in those days, musicians didn't have a very high social ranking, and so they were treated very much like servants. And so his Duke refused to give permission for Bach to leave, but in the end said okay, and he kicked him out. He dismissed him in disgrace, but not before throwing him in jail for nearly a month. Isn't that amazing? Well, Bach didn't waste his time in jail. He was always productive. And so now I'm going to play you a piece, and I'd like you to use your imagination. This piece is very special in that it doesn't use a melody, it doesn't use a tune. Instead, it tells us the story just by the chords, by the harmony. So imagine a journey the music is telling you. Beautiful. That was the prelude to the Well-Tempered Clavier. That was in C major. Now I'm going to move on to the classical period and tell you about two composers from this period, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, who was born in 1756, and Ludwig van Beethoven, who was born in 1770. We'll start out with Mozart. Mozart was born into a court situation in that his father was a violinist at a court. This was the court of Salzburg in Austria. And Wolfgang and his older sister Nannerl were very, very good music students. They were really quite amazing, actually, so much so that their father wanted to take them across Europe to show them off. So from when Mozart was just 6 years old, he started touring across Europe until he was about 17. Now, why would Mozart's father want to do this? This was to secure a position at a court for his son, so that when his son became of age, he could take his pick of court situations and, find the best salary. Well, that would have been great, but it didn't quite work out that way, and I'll tell you why. So, there were a few reasons. First of all, let's start off with the visit to the Empress. When he was 6 years old, she was one of their first stops, and she was the most powerful woman in all of Europe. Her name was Empress Maria Theresia. And Mozart and his sister performed for her. She seemed to like them at the time, and she gave them a gift of some clothing to wear that they could wear at other performances, which was very useful. But what they didn't know is that she told her children, when they grew up and they became kings and queens across Europe, to never hire Mozart, that he and his family had traveled around Europe like beggars. Now, this may seem really shocking to you, but in the time, musicians were treated very much like servants, just like this earlier story of Johann Sebastian Bach going to jail for wanting a new job. Right, so she found this very distasteful, that the Mozarts would just show up unannounced at palaces and ask to perform. She did not like it one bit and thought they should know their place. Now, as part of this touring, I should tell you that it was a difficult journey a lot of the time. You know, they went across Europe with the horse and carriage, and they couldn't just roll up to the front door of these palaces. No, they actually had to go around the back to the servants' quarters, knock on the door, explain who they were, and then probably go to a local inn and wait, sometimes weeks, until they would be granted an audience with the royal and could come in and perform for them. So it was very expensive, and they hoped for money from these royals, but a lot of the time they just had gifts. They had gifts of watches and gold, which they could sell. But this was a difficult life. Now, during these visits, invariably young Mozart would be put to the test, and this actually hurt him getting a position later in life. So, as a little boy, first of all, they would cover the keyboard with a cloth so he couldn't see it, and see if he could still play. Now, he could. That was no problem for him. They would have somebody perform a piece of music in another room, and they would ask Mozart to just listen to it and then play it back by ear. Well, he could do that too. But the hardest test, and this is something very sophisticated to do, is that they would give Mozart and the best musician they had in court a theme, a tune, and they would want them to improvise, to make up on the spot, a piece of music using that theme. Now that is really, really hard to do, even for a great musician. But Mozart was incredibly skilled at this, and, well, he beat all of the musicians and embarrassed them. And so years later, when he was looking for a position at court, well, the answer came back, sorry, no vacancies. They didn't want Mozart showing them up. So, Mozart, when he became of age, he had to have a position at the court of Salzburg, where he had grown up. And he really didn't like it there. He found it very, very boring. And he wanted the exciting stages of Europe in Paris and London and Vienna. So he finally managed to get himself kicked out of the court of Salzburg. And he lived the last 10 years of his life in Vienna as a freelance composer, a composer who makes their living from a variety of ways in music. And so he was putting on concerts and selling tickets for them and collecting that ticket money. He was trying to become close friends with royals so that they would pay to have him write music. There were a number of different ways. And another very important one is he was trying to write popular music that people could perform and they would like, and they would buy the sheet music. Because at this time, in the 1780s and 90s, we had a lot of people who were learning to play music. We had the rise of people, the middle class it's called, so they didn't have to be royals to appreciate music. They could learn it on their own and get lessons and buy it. So we started the commerce, the music business. So Mozart wrote this piece I'm going to play for you in 1785. Actually, it was first published in 1785, but he wrote it a few years before that. And he wrote it deliberately to be popular, and it was based on a well-known tune of the time, a folk tune that he'd heard in Paris. You'll know it as Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. But it is a theme and variation. So you'll hear the theme at first, which is very plain, and then you'll have 3 different versions of it. There are actually 12, but I'll play just 3 today. Listen for the differences between them and try to pick out the theme, the Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, in each variation. we get to Ludwig van Beethoven, and he really changed it all. He really helped music, the music world, how people saw musicians, and the music itself push forward into the next era. Classical music, if you've just heard, in the classical era, was very prim and proper, and Beethoven helped push it to become a little more emotional and expand that sound world. Now, he was born in 1770, also into a court, like Mozart was, but into a court in Germany, in Bonn, and both his father and grandfather were musicians in the court. Now, as a boy, Beethoven was very talented, and when he was 8 years old, his father organized a concert for Beethoven to perform for people. But his father told everybody that Beethoven was actually 6, so he would look really, really talented, and didn't tell Beethoven. So until Beethoven was in his 40s, he actually thought he was 2 years younger than he was. Anyway, luckily for Beethoven, a really good organist moved to the court and became Beethoven's mentor, because his father was not that mentor, even though he was a musician. His father wasn't very present and wasn't very good to Beethoven, so much so that when Beethoven's mother died at 17, Beethoven petitioned the court to have half of his father's salary so that he could raise his 2 younger brothers. So this bad relationship with his father gave him a distrust for authority figures, and this is very important in Beethoven's story. As a young man, at 22, he moved to Vienna, the same place that Mozart had moved to, and he hoped to study with Mozart. But alas, Mozart had just died, and so he studied with Joseph Haydn, who is a great figure of the classical era. In fact, he was called Papa because he started so much. Now, also, Haydn introduced Beethoven to the right people. And at this point in Vienna, it was quite an interesting society with a lot of royals living in Vienna. And instead of having orchestras in Vienna, a lot of them had string quartets. They had chamber music to be played in a chamber, in a room. So they had small collections of musicians, and they would have wonderful parties. They would invite musicians, they would invite composers, and there would be music performed for the royals. And this is really where Beethoven got his start. But it's also the start of what made Beethoven rock the boat a little bit. So if he were asked at a party to perform, and he didn't want to, well, he would say no. Now, this was just unheard of at this point. If he was performing and people started talking while he performed, he got up and he stormed out because he was worth more than that. And so I think you'll start to see that his situation helped change how people saw musicians. And soon enough, people were giving Beethoven a lot more respect, and he became a very, very famous composer. Now, I have a story for you. In 1812, so he was 42 years old, he met the great writer, the most famous writer in all of Germany, Goethe. And they both respected each other's work a lot. But Goethe was quite a bit older than Beethoven, and he had this older view that royalty really needed to be respected and bowed down to. And the two of them were walking down the street. They had just met a few days before, and just by chance, along came a big group, a parade of sorts, of royalty. And now Beethoven intentionally walked right across the street in front of them. He cut them off, and he told Goethe to come with him. Goethe stayed on the side and bowed. But what's very interesting, as the royals at that point, they turned to Beethoven and they bowed to Beethoven. He had substantially changed society just in about 20 years. Now, at that point, he brought Goethe over and he said, I have waited for you because I value your art, but you have to know that history will remember us and not them. So, Beethoven put himself on the same level as those royals and had a lot of those royals as his friends. He had princes he was very close friends with, and he would joke around with them and insult them just like his own friend. So things were changing. But something that could never change in Beethoven's lifetime is that he could not marry a noble woman. And he fell in love with them because he would teach the daughters of wealthy royalty. And even if they loved him back, they could never marry him because he was not of their station. And so I'm going to play you a piece which you just might recognize. You might know it as Für Elise, but it's actually said with a German accent, Für Elise. And it's a mistake, actually. It was actually for Teresa. And Teresa was a student of his he fell in love with, and he asked her to marry him. She said no, she couldn't marry him. But it was the publisher's mistake that published it as Elise. Something I'd like you to pay attention to in this is the structure of it. In the classical period, structure, form of music was very, very important. So you're going to hear a theme which at the beginning, which you'll recognize. And you're going to hear that come back 3 times. So we'll call that A. But in the middle, we go into other areas. So we'll have A, B, something completely different. Listen for A to return. And then we'll have C, something completely different. And then back to A. So this is called a rondo, and it was a really standard form. People could put any music into this type of form. So here is Für Elise by Beethoven. Now, one more thing to mention about Beethoven, which you may know, is that he was deaf. Well, he could hear into his 20s. His hearing started going when he was about 26 years old. But by that point, he had already learned his craft. Like I mentioned to you before, Mozart could sit and write music, well, not at a piano, well, even carrying on a conversation. Well, Beethoven learned to do that. He didn't need to know the piano anymore. He could just think of the music in his head and write it down. Now, the last composer I'm going to be talking about today is Felix Mendelssohn. And Mendelssohn is very important. He's in the Romantic era, by the way. He was born in 1809, but he was writing music starting after 1830 in the Romantic era. And he was important because he brought Bach's music back to life. He lived and worked in Leipzig, where Bach worked at the end of his life, and found all of this great music, and he put it on in concerts, and he arranged for publishers to publish it. And if it weren't for Mendelssohn, well, we might not know the music of Bach today. Also, Mendelssohn was a tremendous supporter of his fellow composers, and Mendelssohn was a conductor as well, and so he could actually choose to play works by fellow composers, and so he helped to get their music out there. Something I'll tell you about Mendelssohn is that he grew up in privilege. He grew up in a very wealthy household, and he was incredibly talented as well. And so at 12 years old, he had written his first opera, would you believe it? And his parents hired the local opera company and orchestra to perform it for his birthday party. Well, isn't that nice? So Mendelssohn, in his career, was very popular as a composer and as a conductor, and he formed a close relationship with Queen Victoria in England, and they asked Mendelssohn to move there and work there, but no, he preferred to be in Germany, and he did do some tremendous things, like set up one of the first universities for music in Leipzig. Now, because of their close friendship, Queen Victoria wanted to honor Mendelssohn, and after his death, she put on a piece of his music at a very important event, and that event was her daughter's wedding. Now, Mendelssohn had written music to go along with Shakespeare's play, A Midsummer Night's Dream. And by the way, this was very popular in the Romantic era. The composers would write music to works of literature, to books and to plays. And composers were also fascinated with anything supernatural or anything that comes from the darkness or from dreams. So music became very, very expressive and often told a story. Back to this now, Queen Victoria put on Mendelssohn's wedding march from the famous wedding scene in A Midsummer Night's Dream for her daughter's wedding in 1858. And we all know that royals set trends, and so this piece became the most famous wedding march of all time. There we are. I hope you recognize that one. Thank you for joining me today for this edition of Meet the Greats.